After my bankruptcy, I lost everything and became an airport shoe shiner. Yesterday, a young billionaire sat in my chair without even looking at my face. When I rolled up his pant leg to polish his shoes, I saw the same birthmark I have. I asked for his name, and when I realized who he was, I froze. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Henry Walker and I'm 57 years old. 3 years ago, I was running my own construction company with 12 employees and contracts worth over $2 million a year. Today, I shine shoes at Denver International Airport for $8 an hour plus tips. The fall wasn't gradual. It was swift and brutal, like a building collapsing in on itself. Bad investments, a lawsuit that drained my savings, and a business partner who disappeared with what little money was left. Within 6 months, I lost everything. My company, my house, my truck, even my tools. The only thing I kept was my pride, and frankly, that's been more of a burden than a blessing. I wake up every morning at 4:30, take 2 buses to get to the airport, and set up my small shoe shine station near gate B12. The irony isn't lost on me that I once built the very terminal where I now work, crawling around on my hands and knees, polishing the shoes of people who wouldn't have looked twice at me when I was wearing a suit. Most days blur together in a haze of leather conditioner and small talk with travelers who see me as part of the airport furniture. I've learned to make myself invisible, to smile and nod while wealthy businessmen talk over my head about deals worth more than I'll make in 10 years. It's survival. Pure and simple. Yesterday started like any other Tuesday. The morning rush was typical. A few regulars, some tourists with scuffed sneakers, and the occasional business traveler who actually tips decently. I was cleaning my brushes when I heard expensive footsteps approaching. Italian leather, probably custom-made, the kind that announces money before you even see the person wearing them. I looked up to see a young man, maybe early 30s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his watch caught the terminal lights, and everything about him screamed success. He didn't look at me when he sat down, just pulled out his phone and immediately started typing with the intensity of someone whose time is worth hundreds of dollars per minute. "Just a quick shine," he said without looking up from his screen. His voice was clipped, efficient, the tone of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. I nodded and got to work, even though he couldn't see my acknowledgement. This was normal. Most customers treated me like a service, not a person. I'd long since stopped taking it personally. As I worked, I found myself studying him more closely than usual. There was something familiar about his profile, though I couldn't place what it was. His jawline was sharp, his features aristocratic in a way that suggested good breeding and better nutrition than I'd ever been able to afford. When he occasionally glanced up from his phone, I caught glimpses of dark eyes that seemed perpetually irritated, as if the world consistently failed to meet his expectations. I was working on his left shoe when I needed to adjust his pant leg to get a better angle on the leather near his ankle. That's when I saw it. A birthmark, small crescent-shaped, dark brown against pale skin. It was positioned just above his ankle bone, exactly where mine was. My hands froze. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was seeing. I have the same birthmark in the exact same place. I've had it my entire life, and my mother always told me it made me special, that it was like having my own personal signature from God. I forced myself to keep working, but my hands were shaking now. It had to be a coincidence. Birthmarks weren't that uncommon, were they? But this one was identical. The same shape, the same size, the same unusual curve that had always reminded me of a tiny crescent moon. "Are you finished?" His voice cut through my racing thoughts. I blinked, realizing I'd been staring at his ankle for what must have been several seconds. "Sorry, sir. Just making sure I got everything." I quickly finished the shine, my mind spinning. When I was done, he examined his shoes with the critical eye of someone who expected perfection and usually found fault. Apparently satisfied, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. "Keep the change," he said, still not really looking at me. As he started to stand, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was the need to know if I was losing my mind, but before I could stop myself, I spoke up. "Excuse me, sir?" My voice came out rougher than I intended. He paused, finally making eye contact with me for the first time. Up close, his eyes were even darker than I'd thought. Almost black, with long lashes that would have been pretty on a woman. There was impatience in his gaze, the look of a busy man being delayed by someone insignificant. "What is it?" My throat felt dry. Could you tell me your name?" His eyebrows drew together in a slight frown. "Why?" I scrambled for a reasonable explanation, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I keep track of my regular customers," I lied. "In case you come back?" He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with the air of someone doing a small favor for someone beneath his notice, he said, "Marcus Thompson." The world tilted. Thompson, Sarah Thompson. My legs went weak and I had to grip the arm of my chair to keep from falling over. Marcus Thompson, 32 years, old if I had to guess. The timing was right, the age was right. And that birthmark. "Are you all right?" he asked, his irritation now mixed with what might have been concern, though it was hard to tell. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even nod. I just stared at him, this successful, arrogant young man who might be my son, the child I'd never known, the baby that Sarah Thompson had carried away from me 33 years ago, without ever looking back. He took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with my reaction. "Okay, well, thanks for the shine." I watched him walk away, his expensive shoes gleaming under the terminal lights, his confident stride carrying him toward a gate where first-class passengers were already boarding. Marcus Thompson. My mind kept repeating the name like a prayer or a curse, I couldn't tell which. I sat there for a long time after he disappeared, staring at the $20 bill in my hand and trying to process what had just happened. Other potential customers walked by, but I couldn't focus on anything except that birthmark and that name and the terrible, wonderful possibility that the life I thought I'd lost completely might have just walked back into it wearing a $1,000 suit. But as the shock began to wear off, a new feeling crept in. If Marcus Thompson was my son, then he had just looked right through me like I was nothing. He had treated me like a servant, someone so far beneath him that basic courtesy was optional. The irony was brutal and sharp. After 33 years of wondering about my child, I had finally found him, only to discover that he was everything I had once been and everything I was no longer. The thought that followed was even worse. What if he was better off not knowing who I really was? I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the thin mattress in my studio apartment, staring at the water-stained ceiling and thinking about Sarah Thompson. 33 years had passed since I'd last seen her face, but her memory came flooding back with painful clarity. Sarah had been 24 when we met, and I was 25. I was working construction then too, but I was hungry, ambitious, convinced that I was going to build something meaningful with my hands and my determination. She was a receptionist at an architectural firm, smart and beautiful in a way that made me feel like I'd won the lottery just by getting her to notice me. We dated for 8 months, 8 months of believing that we were building something together, that we wanted the same things. She would talk about the future sometimes, about houses with white picket fences and children with my eyes and her smile. I was fool enough to believe her. When she told me she was pregnant, I was terrified but also excited. I remember dropping to one knee right there in her tiny apartment kitchen and asking her to marry me with a ring I'd bought with money I'd borrowed from my foreman. She said yes, and for about 2 weeks I thought my life was perfect. Then she changed her mind. "I can't do this, Henry," she said on a rainy Thursday morning that I still remember with painful precision. "I can't marry you. I can't have this baby with you." I begged her to explain, to help me understand what had gone wrong. Her answer cut deeper than any physical wound I'd ever received. "Look at yourself," she said, her voice gentle but merciless. "Look at what you are. You're a construction worker who barely finished high school. You live paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment. What kind of life could you give a child? What kind of future?" I tried to argue, tried to tell her that I was working towards something bigger, that I had plans and dreams and the determination to make them real. But she shook her head with the sad certainty of someone who had already made up her mind. "I want better for this baby," she said. "I want better for myself. I'm sorry, Henry, but I can't tie my life to someone who's never going to be more than what you are right now." She left town the next week. Her friends told me she'd gone back to live with family in Colorado, but they wouldn't tell me where exactly. I tried to find her for months, driving to every small town in the state, asking questions, following dead-end leads. I even hired a private investigator with money I didn't have. But Sarah Thompson had effectively disappeared. I never saw her again. I never knew if she'd had the baby, if she'd given birth to a son or daughter, if the child was healthy, if they needed anything from me. For 33 years I'd carried that uncertainty like a weight in my chest. Now lying in the dark and listening to my upstairs neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls, I tried to process what I'd discovered. Marcus Thompson. The right age, the right last name, and that unmistakable birthmark that marked him as mine as surely as if I'd signed his birth certificate. But what kind of man had he become? In the brief interaction we'd shared, I'd seen arrogance, dismissiveness, the casual cruelty of someone who'd never learned to see service workers as human beings. Was that Sarah's influence, or was it just a natural result of growing up with money and privilege? The next morning I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. Instead of taking the bus to the airport, I walked to the public library and spent the day researching Marcus Thompson. What I found made my heart sink and swell simultaneously. Marcus Thompson was the founder and CEO of Thompson Hospitality Group, a chain of luxury boutique hotels that had exploded across the western United States over the past decade. According to Forbes, his net worth was estimated at somewhere north of $50 million. He'd started the company when he was 22 with what the articles described as family money and an intuitive understanding of what wealthy travelers wanted. The photos accompanying the articles showed a progression from young entrepreneur to established business magnate. In the earliest pictures, he looked softer somehow, more approachable. As the years passed and his success grew, his expression became harder, more distant. The most recent photos showed the man I'd met yesterday, polished, successful, and utterly unreachable. I read every article I could find, searching for any mention of his family or background. Most were focused on his business acumen and expansion plans, but a few lifestyle pieces mentioned that he was single, notoriously private about his personal life, and had been raised by his late mother after his father abandoned the family when Marcus was very young. Abandoned the family. The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had told him that I'd abandoned them. After she'd disappeared without a trace, after she'd refused to let me be part of our child's life, she'd rewritten history to make me the villain. Marcus had grown up believing that his father was a deadbeat who'd chosen not to be part of his life. I spent hours staring at his photos, looking for traces of myself in his features. The dark hair might have come from Sarah, but the shape of his hands in one picture, the way he held his head in another, those were mine. The stubborn set of his jaw when he was clearly irritated with a reporter's question was pure Henry Walker. But the more I read, the more complicated the picture became. Yes, he was successful and wealthy beyond anything I could have imagined, but there were hints of something else. An interview from 2 years ago mentioned that he'd struggled with personal demons but had found focus through work. Another article referenced a brief hospitalization that his publicist had described as exhaustion, but that industry gossip suggested had been related to alcohol. There were no mentions of close friends, serious relationships, or anyone in his life who seemed to matter to him beyond business associates. For all his success, Marcus Thompson seemed to be profoundly alone. As the library closed and I walked back to my apartment, I found myself thinking about that loneliness. I recognized it because I'd been living with it for years. The difference was that his isolation was cushioned by wealth and achievement, while mine was just isolation. I thought about approaching him, about somehow engineering another meeting where I could tell him the truth, but every time I imagined that conversation, it ended badly. What was I going to say? "Hello, son. I'm the deadbeat father you think abandoned you, except I'm actually just a broke shoeshine guy who lost everything?" The truth was I couldn't give him anything he didn't already have. I couldn't offer him financial security or social status or any of the things that seemed to define success in his world. All I had was the truth about what had really happened 33 years ago, and I wasn't even sure he'd want to hear it. But as I lay in bed, that second sleepless night, I realized something that made my chest ache with a mixture of hope and dread. Marcus Thompson might have everything money could buy, but from everything I'd read, he didn't have family. He didn't have anyone who loved him unconditionally, anyone who saw him as more than his net worth or his business achievements. Maybe, just maybe, that was something I could give him, if I was brave enough to try. The question that kept me awake until dawn was whether a failed construction worker turned shoeshine man had any right to disrupt the life of a successful businessman, even if that businessman was his son. The third day after my discovery, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. I was going to find out everything I could about my son's life, even if it meant stepping completely outside my comfort zone. I started by visiting the main branch of the Denver Public Library, where I could access newspaper archives and business databases that weren't available on the basic internet connection at the smaller branch near my apartment. What I discovered over the next several hours painted a picture that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Sarah had died 10 years ago from breast cancer. The obituary was brief, mentioning that she was survived by her son Marcus and that she had been the founder of Thompson Real Estate Development, a company that had built several prominent office complexes in the Denver metro area during the 80s and 90s. There was no mention of Marcus's father, living or dead, but it was the details I found in the business journals that really told the story. Sarah hadn't just been successful, she'd been ruthlessly ambitious. After leaving me, she'd apparently married a man named Richard Thompson, a real estate developer 20 years her senior who'd had the money and connections she'd been looking for. The marriage had lasted only 3 years, ending in divorce when Marcus was 4, but Sarah had kept the Thompson name and used Richard's initial investment to build her own empire. By the time Marcus graduated from high school, Thompson Real Estate Development was worth over $15 million. Sarah had given her son everything she'd thought I couldn't provide. Private schools, expensive clothes, connections to influential people, and most importantly, the kind of social status that opened doors before you even had to knock. But money, I was learning, came with its own complications. I found an interview Marcus had given to Colorado Business Magazine 5 years earlier, shortly after his mother's death. The journalist had asked him about inheriting the family business, and his answer revealed more than he probably intended. My mother built Thompson Real Estate to prove that she could succeed in a man's world, he'd said. But real estate development never interested me. I sold the company 6 months after she died and used the proceeds to start Thompson Hospitality Group. I think she would have understood. She always told me that success meant having the courage to build something that was entirely your own. Reading between the lines, I could see the pressure he'd grown up under. Sarah had built her empire partly to justify the choice she'd made when she left me, and Marcus had inherited not just her money but also the burden of proving that her sacrifice had been worthwhile. The more I researched, the clearer it became that Marcus's success had come at a personal cost. Business publications praised his vision and work ethic, but lifestyle magazines painted a picture of a man who worked 18-hour days and had never been in a relationship that lasted longer than 6 months. There were rumors about drinking, about explosive arguments with employees, about perfectionism so intense that his executive team had a notoriously high turnover rate. One article from 3 years ago particularly caught my attention. It was a profile piece titled "The Loneliness of Success: How Marcus Thompson Built an Empire While Building Walls." The journalist had managed to get Marcus to open up more than usual, and his quotes revealed a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "People assume that money solves all your problems," he'd said, "but it doesn't solve the fundamental question of whether anyone would care about you if you lost everything tomorrow. When your entire identity is built around what you've achieved rather than who you are, it's hard to trust that any relationship is genuine." When asked about family, his response was even more telling. "My mother was the only person who ever believed in me unconditionally. Since she died, I've had to accept that some people are meant to go through life alone. It's not necessarily tragic. It's just reality." I had to stop reading for a moment because my hands were shaking. This successful, wealthy man was describing the exact loneliness I'd felt my entire adult life, except he'd reached that conclusion while surrounded by luxury, while I'd reached it in a studio apartment that smelled like old cooking grease. Sarah had tried to give him everything, but she couldn't give him the one thing he seemed to need most: the security of knowing he was loved for who he was, not what he could provide. That afternoon I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old foreman, Mike Rodriguez, who'd been like a father to me when I was learning the construction trade. Mike was retired now, but he still had connections throughout the industry. "Henry Walker," he said when he heard my voice, genuine warmth in his tone. "I was wondering when you'd call. How are you holding up?" I gave him the basics of my current situation without dwelling on the details. Mike had tried to help me when my business failed, offering me loans I couldn't accept and job opportunities I'd been too proud to take. I regretted that pride now. "Mike, I need a favor," I said. "Do you know anyone working on commercial projects downtown, specifically anyone working on Thompson Hospitality Properties?" Mike was quiet for a moment. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Yeah, actually, my nephew Carlos is doing electrical work on a renovation project at one of their hotels." "Why?" I took a deep breath. "I need a job, something temporary, something that would put me inside one of their buildings." "Henry, you sure about this? I know you've been going through a rough patch, but construction work after 3 years away, it's going to be hard on your body." He was right, of course. At 57, after 3 years of relatively sedentary work, jumping back into physical labor would be brutal. But I needed to see Marcus in his element, to understand who he really was beyond the polished image in magazine articles. "I'm sure," I said. "Can you make a call?" 2 days later, I was wearing a hard hat and work boots for the first time in 3 years, walking into the lobby of the Thompson Grand downtown, one of Marcus's flagship properties. The hotel was undergoing a major renovation of its conference facilities, and Carlos had gotten me hired as general labor. Basically the guy who cleaned up after the skilled workers and moved heavy things from one place to another. It was humbling work, but it put me exactly where I needed to be. The Thompson Grand was everything I'd expected from Marcus's company. Elegant, expensive. Designed for people who expected the best of everything. The lobby featured marble floors that probably cost more than I'd made in the past year, and the artwork on the walls looked like it belonged in a museum. But it was also cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Everything was perfect, but nothing felt warm or welcoming. It was beautiful in the way a photograph was beautiful, impressive to look at, but somehow lacking in soul. On my 3rd day at the job site, I saw him. Marcus walked through the lobby at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, moving with the same confident stride I remembered from the airport. He was wearing a different suit, but the same expression of focused intensity, checking his phone as he walked and barely acknowledging the hotel staff who greeted him. I was mopping the floor near the elevators when he passed, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and hear him speaking sharply to someone on his phone about quarterly projections and market expansion. He didn't even glance in my direction. But watching him in his own environment, I saw things I'd missed during our brief encounter at the airport. The tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was looking, the fact that none of the employees seemed comfortable around him, greeting him with the kind of nervous deference usually reserved for people who were known for being unpredictable. Over the next week, I learned his routine. He arrived every day between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, spent exactly 90 minutes walking through the hotel and meeting with managers, then left without any social interaction that wasn't strictly business-related. He never smiled, never made small talk, never seemed to take any pleasure in the beautiful space he'd created. It was during one of these observations that I overheard a conversation between 2 hotel managers that changed everything I thought I knew about my son. "He's getting worse," one of them said in a hushed voice as they stood near the service elevator. "Jennifer in accounting said he threw a coffee cup across his office yesterday because the monthly reports were 10 minutes late." "Did you see him last week when that guest complained about the room service?" the other replied. "I thought he was going to fire the entire kitchen staff over Eggs Benedict. I heard from someone at the corporate office that he's been having those episodes again. You know, like he had after his mother died. Panic attacks or something." My chest tightened. Panic attacks. The successful billionaire who seemed to have everything was falling apart, just like I had 3 years ago. The difference was that he was falling apart in a corner office instead of a bankruptcy lawyer's waiting room. "Someone needs to talk to him," the first manager continued. "But who's going to do that? He doesn't have any friends, no family, just that assistant who's too scared to say anything real to him." "The money doesn't help with that kind of thing," the second manager said sadly. My dad always said that loneliness is the only problem money makes worse. As they walked away, I stood there with my mop in my hands, trying to process what I'd learned. Marcus wasn't just isolated. He was actively pushing people away, lashing out at the employees who depended on him, creating the very loneliness he claimed to accept as inevitable. And suddenly I understood something that changed everything. My son wasn't better off without me. He was drowning, just like I had been, except he was drowning in success instead of failure. The money and status that Sarah had thought would protect him had become walls that kept everyone at a safe distance, including the people who might actually care about him if he'd let them. For the first time since I'd recognized his birthmark, I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I had something to offer him after all. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came on a Thursday afternoon during my second week working at the Thompson Grand. I was in the basement utility room, organizing supplies for the next day's work, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone having a panic attack. The sharp, rapid breathing was coming from the stairwell just outside the utility room. I knew that sound intimately. I'd made it myself more times than I could count during the worst months after my business collapsed. The feeling of your chest closing up, your heart racing like it was trying to escape your body, the absolute certainty that you were about to die, even though rationally you knew you weren't. I set down the box of electrical supplies I'd been carrying and moved quietly toward the stairwell door. Through the small window, I could see someone sitting on the concrete steps, head in their hands, shoulders shaking with the effort to breathe normally. It was Marcus. He was still wearing his expensive suit, but his tie was loosened and his usually perfect hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. His breathing was harsh and uneven, and even from where I stood I could see that his hands were trembling. I should have walked away. I should have given him privacy, pretended I hadn't seen anything, minded my own business like any sensible employee would do. Instead, I found myself pushing open the stairwell door. He looked up when he heard the door open, and the expression on his face was pure terror. Not because he was afraid of me, but because he'd been caught in a moment of complete vulnerability. His eyes were wide and glassy, and there was a desperate quality to the way he was trying to control his breathing. "Sorry," I said quietly, making my voice as non-threatening as possible. "Just checking on you. Are you okay?" He tried to straighten up, tried to reassemble the mask of control he usually wore, but another wave of panic hit him before he could speak. His breathing became even more labored, and he pressed his back against the wall like he was trying to disappear into it. I'd been exactly where he was. I knew that the worst part wasn't the physical symptoms. It was the shame, the humiliation of feeling so completely out of control. Without thinking about it, I sat down on the step below him, far enough away that he wouldn't feel trapped, but close enough that he'd know he wasn't alone. "It's going to pass," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but it will pass. Just focus on breathing out longer than you breathe in. Don't try to fight it, just let it happen." He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language, but after a moment he nodded slightly and tried to follow my instructions. We sat there in silence for several minutes while his breathing gradually slowed and the color returned to his face. When he finally seemed stable, he looked at me with confusion and something that might have been gratitude. "How did you know what to do?" I could have lied. I could have said I'd read about panic attacks somewhere or that I'd seen someone else go through one. Instead, I told him the truth. "Because I've been there," I said simply. "More times than I'd like to admit." He studied my face for a long moment, really looking at me for the first time since I'd started working in his building. "You work for the renovation crew?" It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "Henry Walker, General Labor." "Marcus Thompson." He said it automatically, then seemed to realize how strange it was to introduce himself to someone who obviously already knew who he was. "Thank you for this. I don't usually have panic attacks in stairwells," I suggested gently. He almost smiled. Almost. "Have witnesses when I fall apart." We sat there for another moment in comfortable silence. Marcus seemed to be debating whether to leave or stay, whether to pretend this hadn't happened or acknowledge that it had. Finally, he spoke again. "What triggered yours?" "The panic attacks, I mean." I could have given him a sanitized version, something safe and generic about work stress, But something about the way he'd asked the question, the genuine curiosity mixed with desperation, made me want to be honest. I lost everything, I said. My business, my house, my sense of who I was. For a while it felt like the world was ending every single day. He nodded slowly, like this made perfect sense to him. What stopped them? Time, mostly. And accepting that having everything fall apart doesn't actually kill you, even though it feels like it should. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing this. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if you never had anything real to begin with? What if everything you think you've built is just empty? The question hit me like a physical blow because I could hear the pain behind it. This wasn't about business or money or success. This was about a man who'd spent his entire adult life trying to prove he was worth something, only to discover that external validation couldn't fill the hole that had been carved out of him when he was too young to understand what was happening. Then you start over, I said. You figure out what's actually real and you build from there. Easy to say when you don't have hundreds of people depending on you for their livelihoods, he said, but there was no bitterness in it. Just exhaustion. Harder to do when you're trying to be everything to everyone except yourself. I countered gently. He looked at me sharply as if I'd said something that cut too close to the truth. For a moment I thought he might get angry, might reassert his authority and remind me that I was just a construction worker who had no business offering life advice to a successful businessman. Instead he laughed. It was a short, bitter sound, but it was genuine. How does a guy doing renovation work know so much about existential crisis management? Same way a successful hotel mogul ends up having panic attacks in basement stairwells, I said. Life is complicated for everybody. This time his laugh was a little less bitter. He stood up slowly, straightening his tie and running his hands through his hair in an attempt to restore some semblance of his usual polished appearance. I should get back upstairs, he said. I have a meeting in 20 minutes. I nodded and started to stand as well, but he held up a hand to stop me. Henry, he said, and hearing my name in his voice made something twist in my chest. This conversation, I'd prefer if it stayed between us. Of course, I said. Your business is your business. He nodded gratefully, then started up the stairs. But halfway to the next landing, he stopped and turned back. If you ever want to talk, he said awkwardly, as if he wasn't sure how to make the offer. About the panic attacks or whatever. I'm usually here most afternoons around 3. It wasn't much, but it was an opening, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. As I watched him disappear up the stairs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Over the next several days, I found myself looking forward to 3 o'clock in a way that had nothing to do with work schedules. Marcus began acknowledging me when he walked through the lobby, not quite smiling, but no longer looking through me like I was invisible. Sometimes if his afternoon rounds finished early, he would stop by wherever I was working and we would have brief, careful conversations about nothing in particular. He never mentioned the panic attack again, but I could see him watching me sometimes, studying my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. There was something almost desperate about the attention he paid to our conversations, as if he was starving for genuine human interaction and didn't quite know how to ask for it. I learned things about him during those brief encounters that no business magazine had ever reported. He was afraid of elevators but rode them constantly because admitting the fear would show weakness. He hadn't taken a vacation in 6 years because being alone with his thoughts for extended periods made him anxious. He ate the same lunch every day, a turkey sandwich from the hotel restaurant, because making decisions about food felt overwhelming when he was already making hundreds of other decisions about business. These weren't the habits of a confident, successful businessman. They were the coping mechanisms of someone barely holding himself together. The breakthrough came on a Friday afternoon when I was painting the trim around some new windows in the conference center. Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His tie was crooked, there was a coffee stain on his shirt, and his usually perfect hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. "Bad day?" I asked, not stopping my painting but keeping my tone light. "I fired 3 people today," he said, slumping against the doorframe. 3 good people who were just trying to do their jobs, and I fired them because I couldn't handle my own stress. I set down my brush and turned to face him fully. What happened? Nothing happened. That's the problem. I woke up feeling like everything was wrong, like the walls were closing in, and instead of dealing with it like a rational adult, I took it out on everyone around me. He laughed bitterly. I'm turning into my mother. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah, and the pain in his voice when he said it made my chest ache. I wanted to tell him that he wasn't anything like his mother, that Sarah had been cold and calculating while he was just scared and lonely. But I couldn't say that without revealing who I was. Did you apologize? I asked instead. How do you apologize for being a monster? By starting with I'm sorry, and meaning it, I said simply. And then by doing better tomorrow. He looked at me like I'd suggested something revolutionary. You really think it's that simple? I think it's that hard, I corrected. Simple and easy aren't the same thing. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city below. When he spoke again, his voice was so soft I almost didn't hear him. I don't think I know how to be better. I've been this way for so long, I don't remember what it feels like to actually connect with another person. The vulnerability in that admission made my heart break. This was my son, this lonely, brilliant, damaged man who had everything except the one thing he needed most. And I was right there, close enough to touch him, but separated by 33 years of lies and misunderstandings that I didn't know how to bridge. Maybe you start small, I suggested. Maybe you call those 3 people you fired and offer them their jobs back. He looked at me with something that might have been wonder. You really think they'd want to come back? I think people are more forgiving than you expect them to be, I said. Especially if you give them a reason to believe you're trying to change. That night I lay awake thinking about the conversation and about the impossible situation I'd created for myself. I was getting closer to Marcus, earning his trust in a way that felt both wonderful and terrible. Wonderful because I was finally getting to know my son, and terrible because I was doing it under false pretenses. But for the first time in 33 years I was having an actual relationship with my child. And despite the deception involved, it was the most real thing in my life. The changes in Marcus over the following weeks were subtle but unmistakable. He'd taken my advice and called the 3 employees he'd fired, offering them their jobs back with raises and personal apologies. 2 of them returned, and I could see the relief in his face when he told me about it during one of our increasingly frequent conversations. Jennifer in accounting said she'd never had a boss apologize to her before, he said, and there was something almost childlike in his amazement at this. She actually seemed grateful to come back. People want to work for someone who treats them like human beings, I told him. It's not complicated. It is for me, he admitted. I've been thinking about what you said, about connecting with people, and I realized I don't actually know how to do that. My mother raised me to see relationships as transactions. You give something, you get something back. But what you're describing sounds different. I was touched by his honesty and terrified by how close we were getting to territory I wasn't ready to navigate. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield, trying to give him the guidance he desperately needed, while avoiding any topic that might reveal who I really was. Relationships aren't transactions, I said carefully. They're investments. Sometimes you give more than you get. Sometimes you get more than you give. But if both people are committed to the long term, it balances out. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Can I ask you something personal? My heart rate immediately spiked, but I tried to keep my voice steady. Sure. Do you have family? Kids? The question hit me like a physical blow. I had to grip the paint can I was holding to keep my hands from shaking. How could I answer that? How could I tell him that yes, I had a son, and he was sitting right in front of me, asking me about the family he didn't know he had? It's complicated, I said finally, which was perhaps the biggest understatement of my life. Complicated how? I could feel myself approaching a cliff edge, but something in his voice made me want to give him at least part of the truth. I had a son once, a long time ago. His mother and things didn't work out. I never got to be part of his life. Marcus leaned forward, his business executive mask completely forgotten. That must have been devastating. The genuine sympathy in his voice almost broke me. Here was my son feeling sorry for me because I'd never gotten to know my son. The irony was so painful it was almost funny. It was, I said quietly. For a long time it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. But lately I've been thinking that maybe it's not too late. Maybe there's still a chance to, I don't know, to try to build something real. Have you tried to contact him? He doesn't know I exist, I said, which was technically true. His mother told him I'd abandoned them. As far as he knows, his father is someone who chose not to be part of his life. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out the window with an expression I couldn't interpret. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. My father left when I was born. My mother always said he couldn't handle the responsibility, that he was too selfish to put anyone else's needs before his own. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart with their bare hands. Sarah had poisoned him against me so thoroughly that he'd built his entire identity around the belief that his father was a coward who'd run away rather than face the challenges of parenthood. Maybe there was more to the story than your mother knew, I suggested gently. Marcus shook his head with the certainty of someone who'd heard the same story his entire life. She never lied to me about anything else. Besides, what other explanation could there be? If he'd wanted to be part of my life, he would have found a way. The accusation in those words cut deeper than any knife. Marcus believed that if his father had truly cared, nothing would have stopped him from being there. He had no idea that his father had tried desperately to find them, that he'd spent months driving through Colorado asking questions and following dead ends, that he'd hired private investigators with money he couldn't afford. Sometimes people make mistakes, I said carefully. Sometimes they make choices that seem right at the time but turn out to be wrong. And sometimes other people make choices for them. Are you defending him? Marcus asked, and there was a sharpness in his voice that reminded me uncomfortably of Sarah. I'm just saying that maybe the truth is more complicated than you know. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. You know what the worst part is? I used to fantasize about him coming back. When I was a kid, I would imagine him walking through the door and explaining that it had all been a mistake, that he'd been looking for us the whole time. I would picture this big reunion where he'd tell me how sorry he was and how much he loved me. Each word was like a separate wound. I had to bite my tongue to keep from telling him that those fantasies weren't far from the truth, that his father had been looking for him, that he did love him more than anything in the world. What changed? I asked instead. I grew up, he said bitterly. I realized that if someone wants to be part of your life, they find a way, and if they don't find a way, it's because they don't want to badly enough. The conversation was becoming too painful to continue, but Marcus wasn't finished. My mother used to say that my father's abandonment was actually a gift, because it taught her that she couldn't rely on anyone but herself. She built her entire business empire to prove that she didn't need him, that we were better off without him. I thought about Sarah, about the driven, ambitious woman who'd left me because she'd wanted better for her child. Had she really believed she was protecting Marcus, or had she been protecting herself from the possibility of being disappointed again? Did that make you feel better? I asked, knowing that you were better off without him. Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he answered, his voice was full of a pain that sounded decades old. No, he said simply. It made me feel like I was fundamentally unlovable, like there was something wrong with me that made my own father choose to walk away. I had to turn away from him because I couldn't trust my expression to remain neutral. The idea that Marcus had spent his entire life believing he was unlovable, that his father's absence was somehow his fault, was almost unbearable. That's not true, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Sometimes the people who leave aren't leaving because of who you are. Sometimes they are leaving because of who they are, or because of circumstances beyond their control. How do you know? He asked. Because I'm your father, and leaving you was the worst thing that ever happened to me, I wanted to say. Because I've spent 33 years wondering about you and regretting choices that weren't even mine to make. Instead, I said, Because I know something about abandonment, and I know that the people who get left behind aren't the problem. They're just collateral damage in someone else's story. Marcus studied my face with an intensity that made me nervous. You talk like you have personal experience with this. We all have personal experience with something, I said. That's what makes us human. Over the next few days, our conversations became deeper and more frequent. Marcus started seeking me out, not just when he was having a crisis, but when he wanted to talk through business decisions or share something that had happened during his day. It was becoming clear that he was starving for genuine connection, for someone who would listen to him without an agenda. The problem was that I did have an agenda, even if it wasn't the one he would have expected. I found myself in the impossible position of being the father figure he'd never had, while simultaneously being the father he thought had abandoned him. Every piece of advice I gave him, every moment of support, felt both natural and fraudulent. But I couldn't stop. For the first time in 33 years, I was getting to know my son, and despite the deception involved, it was the most meaningful relationship I'd ever had. The crisis came on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. I was working late, finishing up some detail work in the conference center, when I heard shouting coming from the direction of Marcus's office on the 3rd floor. The hotel's soundproofing was excellent, so if I could hear it from 2 floors down, it had to be loud. I put down my tools and made my way upstairs, telling myself I was just concerned about the noise disturbing the hotel guests. But really I was worried about Marcus. The shouting was coming from behind the closed door of the executive suite. I could hear Marcus's voice roar with fury, and another man's voice trying to respond. As I got closer, I could make out some of the words. 3 months behind schedule and $50,000 over budget, Marcus was yelling. How do you explain that? If you'd just let me, the other voice began. Don't make excuses. I trusted you with this project, and you've completely failed. There was a crash, like something being thrown against a wall, and then sudden silence. A moment later, the office door opened, and a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit hurried out, his face flushed and his hands shaking. He didn't look at me as he headed for the elevators. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to knock or just walk away. But something about the quality of the silence from inside the office made me worry that Marcus was having another panic attack. I knocked gently on the door. Marcus, it's Henry. Are you okay? No answer. I knocked again, a little louder. Marcus? Go away, came his voice, muffled and strained. I'm not going anywhere until I know you're all right. There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened to reveal Marcus, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His hair was disheveled, his tie was askew, and there was a wild look in his eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of myself during my worst days. I'm fine, he said, but his voice was shaking. No, you're not. I pushed past him into the office, noting the overturned chair and the scattered papers that suggested his earlier outburst had been physical as well as verbal. What happened? I lost it, he said simply, slumping into his desk chair. Again, I completely lost control and screamed at David until he was afraid to be in the same room with me. Who's David? My project manager. A good man with a wife and 3 kids who depends on this job to support his family. And I just destroyed him because I couldn't handle my own stress. I could see that he was spiraling, falling into the same pattern of self-hatred that had driven him to lash out in the first place. I'd been there myself, caught in the cycle of stress, explosion, guilt, and more stress. Did you fire him? No, yes, I don't know. I told him to get out, but I didn't actually use the word fired. Does it matter? It matters, I said, because that means you can fix this. Marcus looked at me like I'd suggested he could fly to the moon. How do you fix something like that? How do you apologize for becoming a monster? The same way you fixed it with those 3 employees last month, I said. You call David right now, you apologize sincerely, and you ask him to come in tomorrow so you can talk about how to prevent this from happening again. What if he won't come back? Then you'll have learned something important about the consequences of your actions, I said. But my guess is that he will come back, especially if you give him a real apology instead of just saying you're sorry. Marcus stared at me for a long moment. Why do you care so much? Why are you trying so hard to help me? The question caught me completely off guard. I stood there looking at my son, trying to figure out how to answer without revealing the truth that would change everything between us. Because everybody deserves someone who believes they can be better than they are, I said finally. And because I think you're worth saving, even if you don't believe that yourself. Something in Marcus's expression shifted, and for a moment I saw the little boy he'd once been, the child who'd grown up, believing his father hadn't thought he was worth staying for. "I've never had anyone say that to me before," he said quietly. That night, as I lay in my apartment thinking about our conversation, I realized that I'd reached a point where I couldn't continue indefinitely. Marcus was beginning to trust me, to rely on me for emotional support. But that relationship was built on a foundation of lies by omission that was becoming harder to maintain. Sooner or later, I was going to have to decide whether to tell him the truth or walk away. And I was terrified of what either choice might cost both of us. The decision was made for me on a grey December morning when Marcus arrived at the hotel looking like he hadn't slept in days. The renovation project was nearly finished, which meant my time working in his building was coming to an end. We both knew it, though neither of us had acknowledged it directly. I was packing up my tools when he found me in the basement storage room. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it, and there was something desperate in his expression that made my chest ache. "Henry," he said, and the relief in his voice when he saw me was unmistakable. "I was afraid you'd already left." "Last day," I confirmed, trying to keep my voice casual even though the thought of not seeing him again felt like losing him all over again. "Project's finished." "I know." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd learned meant he was struggling with something difficult. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." I waited, not trusting myself to speak. "I've been thinking about our conversations over the past few weeks," he said, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "About what you said about second chances and starting over. I've decided I want to try to find him." "Find who?" I asked, though I already knew. "My father." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been practicing them. "I know it sounds crazy, and I know there's probably nothing left to salvage after 33 years, but I can't stop thinking about what you said. About how maybe the truth is more complicated than I know." I felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. All these weeks of getting to know him, of building a relationship based on half-truths and careful omissions, and now he was telling me he wanted to find the father who was standing right in front of him. "Marcus," I said slowly, "are you sure about this? Sometimes the truth isn't better than the story you've been telling yourself." "I need to know," he said with the certainty of someone who'd made up his mind. "I've spent my entire life defining myself by his absence, building walls to protect myself from the kind of abandonment he represented. But what if you're right? What if there's more to the story?" I sat down heavily on a stack of paint cans, my mind racing. This was the moment I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Marcus wanted to find his father, and I could either reveal myself or help him search for someone who was already found. "How would you even begin to look for him?" I asked, buying time to think. "I've been researching," he said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "I hired a private investigator last week. It turns out it's not as impossible as I thought." My blood turned to ice. A private investigator would find Henry Walker easily enough. And when they did, they'd discover that Henry Walker was currently working construction at Marcus Thompson's hotel. The deception would be exposed in the worst possible way. "Marcus, maybe you should think about this more carefully." "I already found him," he said quietly. The world stopped spinning. "What?" Marcus opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. My old driver's license photo from before my business failed. He also had copies of newspaper articles about the construction company collapse, bankruptcy filings, and a current address that was remarkably accurate. "Henry Walker," he said, studying the papers. "Born 1968. Owned Walker Construction until it failed 3 years ago due to bad investments and a lawsuit. Currently employed in general labor. Last known address." He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "The same address you gave Human Resources when you were hired." I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. The careful web of half-truths I'd been spinning for weeks was unraveling in real time. The investigator also found records of my mother's relationship with you, Marcus continued, his voice eerily calm, including the fact that she left you when she was pregnant and that you tried to find us for months afterward. Still, I said nothing. What could I say? Marcus set the folder down and looked directly at me. My birth certificate lists my father as unknown, but the investigator found medical records. My blood type, some genetic markers that could only have come from... He gestured to the photograph. From you. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 33 years of missed opportunities and misunderstandings. How long have you known? I finally asked. I started suspecting 2 weeks ago, he said. The way you talked about abandonment, about having a son you'd never known. And then there was something about your voice when you said his name didn't matter, that family was about more than blood. Then why didn't you say anything? Marcus sat down across from me, and for the first time since I'd known him, his business executive mask was completely gone. What I saw underneath was raw and vulnerable and achingly young. Because I was terrified, he admitted. For 33 years, I'd believed that my father was someone who chose to abandon me. Finding out that he was someone who tried to stay, who'd fought to be part of my life. It changed everything I thought I knew about myself. I finally found my voice. I wanted to tell you. Every day I wanted to tell you. But I didn't know how to explain that the deadbeat father you'd been told about was actually just a broken-down construction worker shining shoes at an airport. Is that really how you see yourself? Marcus asked. A broken-down construction worker. Isn't that what I am? Marcus shook his head slowly. You're the man who taught me how to apologize meaningfully. You're the person who helped me understand that relationships aren't transactions. You're the father who sat with me in a stairwell when I was having a panic attack and didn't make me feel ashamed of falling apart. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing in a place I'd kept carefully guarded for decades. You gave me something I'd never had before, Marcus continued. You believed I could be better than I was, and you didn't want anything from me in return. Do you have any idea how rare that is? I thought about all the conversations we'd had, all the moments when I'd wanted to tell him who I was, but had been afraid he'd reject me once he knew the truth. I was terrified you'd hate me, I said. For not fighting harder to find you, for not being successful enough to deserve you, for being the kind of father Sarah was trying to protect you from. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. My mother wasn't protecting me from you. She was protecting herself from the possibility that you might not live up to her expectations. She wanted guarantees that life doesn't provide. She wanted better for you than I could give. She wanted control, Marcus corrected. She wanted to write the story herself instead of letting it unfold naturally, and doing that, she robbed both of us of 33 years. We sat there in the basement storage room, surrounded by paint cans and construction equipment, father and son finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. The expensive suit and the work clothes didn't matter. The corner office and the studio apartment were irrelevant. What mattered was that we were here, together, with the possibility of building something real from the wreckage of missed opportunities. So, what happens now? I asked. Marcus smiled, and it was the first completely genuine smile I'd ever seen from him. Now we start over. We figure out how to be a family, even though neither of us really knows how to do that. I don't have much to offer you, I said. No money, no status, no connections that would help your business. You have something better than all of that, Marcus said. You have the ability to see me as a person instead of just my achievements. Do you know how valuable that is? Over the next several months, Marcus and I began the careful process of building a relationship that had been 33 years in the making. It wasn't always easy. We both carried scars from our respective histories of abandonment and disappointment. But for the first time, in either of our lives, we had someone who understood what those scars meant. Marcus offered me a job at Thompson Hospitality Group, not as general labor, but as a project consultant, helping with construction oversight on new hotel developments. The pay was more than I'd ever imagined making, but more importantly, It meant I could be part of his world without feeling like charity. I moved out of my studio apartment and into a small house that Marcus helped me buy, not as a gift but as an investment in our shared future. We had dinner together twice a week, and slowly, carefully, we began filling in the blank spaces that had defined both our lives. The most remarkable change was in Marcus himself. As he began to trust that I wasn't going to disappear, the angry, isolated businessman began to give way to someone warmer and more connected. His employees noticed the difference immediately. The explosive outbursts stopped. The rigid perfectionism softened into high standards tempered with compassion. 6 months after that conversation in the storage room, I was at Marcus's apartment for our weekly dinner when he brought out a photograph I'd never seen before. It was Sarah, young and beautiful, holding a baby who could only have been Marcus. "I found this in some of her papers," he said. "Look at the back." I turned the photograph over. In Sarah's careful handwriting were the words, "Marcus, age 6 months. He has his father's hands." I stared at the inscription, feeling a complicated mixture of pain and gratitude. Even as she'd been building walls between us, Sarah had recognized the connection that couldn't be erased. "She knew," Marcus said quietly. "She knew you were part of me, even when she was trying to pretend you weren't." That night, as I drove home through the streets of Denver, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. I'd lost everything: my business, my house, my sense of identity, only to find the one thing I'd never dared hope I could recover. Marcus and I would never get back those 33 lost years. We couldn't undo the damage that had been done by well-meaning lies and fear-based decisions. But we could build something new from what remained, something stronger for having been broken and rebuilt. I'd spent my adult life believing that love was something you earned through achievement and success. My son had spent his believing that love was something that could be withdrawn without warning. Together we were learning that real love, the kind that lasts, doesn't depend on what you can provide or how perfectly you perform. It depends on showing up, staying present, and choosing each other every day, even when it's difficult. The shoeshine station at Denver International Airport had been replaced by a newer model, but sometimes when I was traveling for work, I would stop by gate B12 and remember the morning when everything changed. The day when a crescent-shaped birthmark had revealed a truth that 33 years of separation couldn't erase, that some connections are stronger than abandonment, deeper than disappointment, and more enduring than the stories we tell ourselves about why we're alone. I wasn't alone anymore. Neither was Marcus, and for the first time in either of our lives, we both understood what it meant to be truly found.